Aye, my mateys. Today, me, the old sea captain, is gonna tell you a scary full tale of hideous and death and horrible shitty albums. So here we go. It is called The Curse of the Six. Okay, so kind of a weird thing. Now, if you check out many of these long-term heavy metal or hard rock bands, you can kind of see this weird pattern kind of repeating itself. So I'm talking about the original six or the first six studio albums of any basically given band that has kind of a longer recording history. So if we take a look at Black Sabbath, what this means is that the first six albums are considered classic, more or less. Yeah, there are always going to be fans who just listen to the first album and so on, but for the most part, I personally agree that the first six Black Sabbath albums are the classic ones. So from Black Sabbath to Paranoid, Master of Reality Volume 4, Sabbath Body Sabbath, and then Sabotage, which is actually my favorite Black Sabbath album. Now, after that, something weird happened. They just stopped releasing good albums. What you get next is Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. And, meanwhile, there was also a lot of talk about Ozzy leaving Black Sabbath even before that actually happened. So it's kind of weird. We have these six albums and then that same lineup just doesn't work anymore. How about Kiss? Everyone loves Kiss, right? Well, we got the first three albums: Kiss, Hotter Than Hell, Dressed to Kill. Then we get a live album, which doesn't count. Then we get Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, and Love Gun. And that's actually the last original lineup Kiss album. After that, they released another live album. They released some collections. They even released solo albums. But those four guys never play again on the same studio album, because when they get back with Dynasty, Peter Criss doesn't play on the tracks anymore, just on his own track Dirty Living, and pretty soon after that he leaves the band completely. So there you go, just six albums, that's it. What about Motorhead? Well, we get Motorhead, we get Overkill, we get Bomber, we get On Parole, which is another version of their first album. We get Ace of Spades and Iron Fist. And guess what? Then the guitar player leaves the band. So once again, mysterious. Accidento misterioso. One of the original guys disappears. And what you get after that is Another Perfect Day, which isn't a terrible album, but it was a very weird album at the time with a Thin Lizzy guitar player coming and joining the band. So it was a really weird album. Not bad, but strange. How about Judas Priest? Well, we get Rock'n'Rolla, we get Sad Wings of Destiny, Sin After Sin, Stay in Class, Hellbent for Leather, or actually Killing Machine, as it was called in the UK. And then we get British Steel, their sixth album, which was their big breakthrough album. And we don't get any changes in lineup. Actually, after the sixth album, this is almost like the first time that we don't get a different drummer playing for the band. But Point of Entry is hideous. So once again, you get like these six pretty solid albums, and it just keeps getting better, especially like money-wise, publicity-wise, and then it all comes crashing down after album number 6. That's kind of weird. We get AC/DC, we get their Australian releases: High Voltage, TNT, Dirty Deeds, Let There Be Rock, Power Rage, Highway to Hell. And guess what? The singer dies. So after album number 6, there's a huge change in the band before Back in Black and Brian Johnson comes along. So Bon Scott actually dies after the 6th album during that tour. That's weird. You got Van Halen with David Lee Roth, and guess what? They released 6 albums, and 1984 is their 6th album, and after that there's a breakup before Sammy Hagar comes along, and they release 5150, which is a very different album because different singer. Then you get Slayer, and we get 5 classic albums in the 80s. Actually, Seasons in the Abyss, their 5th album, is released in 1990. We do get a breakup after that with Dave Lombardo, but personally I still like Divine Intervention quite a lot in 1994. What we get after that, though, is Undisputed Attitude and Diabolus in Musica, which usually are considered the worst albums that Slayer released. So that's kind of weird. 6 again. Then you get Iron Maiden, starting from their first album called Iron Maiden, and Killers, Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, Power Slave. You get Somewhere in Time, which is still a very cool album. And then we get The Seventh Son, and it's very poppy and keyboardy, and it's shit, really. Once again, 6 good albums, and that's it. Rush, how about with Rush? Okay, we get Rush, we get Fly By Night, we get Caress of Steel, we get 2112, which is their first really successful proggy thing, and that progginess continues on Fell to Kings and Hemispheres. But then after that, they're really, really tired of writing these long songs, and all the pressure has got to them, so they just kind of changed their style. And that happens after their 6th album once again. Then we get Ozzy. And Ozzy releases some stuff in the 80s, and his 6th album called No More Tears in 1991, I think. And actually, it is the first time that everyone's saying, oh, Ozzy's going to retire now. And they kind of like even make that statement themselves, saying this might be the last time you see Ozzy. Well, that wasn't the case, but still, no more tours was what that was called. And Ozzy was supposed to retire in early 90s. And you could argue that those 6 Ozzy solo albums are the classic stuff, and what you get after that is the more modern stuff, starting with Osmosis, and the quality starts certainly getting down at that point. How about Genesis? Well, most people would say they only had 5 classic albums with Peter Gabriel: Trespass, Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, Selling England by the Pound, and then Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which happens to be a double album though. But they did actually release From Genesis to Revelation before Trespass. So once again, 6 albums, and then there's a huge breakup once again. Their singer Peter Gabriel leaves. And after that, what comes is Trick of the Tailwind and Wuthering and so on. A very different band after that. Not necessarily bad, but it changed forever. Peter Gabriel never returned, and they never made another album together. So that's kind of eerie, once again. There are some bands in my list that I pretty much have like only 6 albums from, or where I consider the stuff gets worse after the 6th album. A Japanese band called Loudness. I have their first 6 albums, and after that it just gradually breaks apart. Morbid Angel, I would argue the first 6 studio albums are their best. Altars, Blessed Are the Sick, Covenant, Domination. Arguably, some people complain about that one, but still usually considered a classic album. Foremost Fatal to the Flesh, actually my favorite, and then Gateway's Annihilation. So we're not counting any live albums here. Once again, first 6 studio albums, and there we go. That's eerie. Bruce Dickinson solo albums. I think his 6th one, if you count Skunkworks as number 3, then you get Accident of Birth number 4, Chemical Wedding number 5, which is actually my favorite, and then Tyranny of Souls And now this newest one, it doesn't seem anywhere near as good as the original stuff was. So that's strange. Well, let's think about this in another way. There are certain bands where I don't like the old stuff, like Thin Lizzy and the Beatles. So with Thin Lizzy, there's plenty of those old albums. I don't really care for any of them. But the first album that I really like from them is Jailbreak. And guess what? It's their sixth album. How about the Beatles? I don't really care for their early stuff at all. You know, they had plenty of stuff in 64, 63, you know, even 65. But the oldest Beatles album that I have is Rubber Soul. And guess what? It's their sixth album. Ooh, this is kind of scary, isn't it? You know, some weird boogeyman doing weird tricks with us, I guess. Well, not really. You know, once there's a huge collection of music, you can always cherry pick what you like. For one thing, people don't usually count the Motorhead and On Parole albums as two different things. It's pretty much the same album, just re-recorded. So actually, Iron Fist is usually considered to be their fifth album, not their sixth. So that kind of falls apart there. Then, if you look at Priest, I would still say that the bigger change happened after the 70s, before British Steel. Even though British Steel became this huge successful album, for me it's not really such a great album. So with Priest, I would argue I would actually make that division after album number 5, before they got Dave Holland as part of their lineup. Then AC/DC, yeah, that works. It's an Australian band, so why not go with the Australian album list? However, if you go with the international list, it's only 5 albums. They never released an album called TNT in Europe and in America. Although actually the album that we know as High Voltage is pretty much TNT, the Australian version of TNT. On the other hand, even though the singer changed and there was this tragic death happening with Bon Scott, you know, the stuff they released with Brian Johnson was still really good. Many would argue that Back in Black is one of their best albums, maybe even the best album they ever released. So it doesn't really hold water that something, you know, the band couldn't make any good music after their 6th album. It just doesn't really hold water. Then with Van Halen, 5150 was different, but it was still a really good album. So just saying, well, it went to shit after number 6, that doesn't really hold water. Especially as not all those David Lee Roth albums were that great either. If you look at thrash metal, with Slayer, you might argue number 5 because Dave Lombardo left after that. Yes, it's true that Divine Intervention is still a really good album, but it's still a bit different from the classic ones. Also with Metallica and Megadeth, I would argue for number 5. Consider Black Album, that for many seemed to be the peak or the final decent Metallica album at the very least. Or maybe even just 4. Many say that Justice for All is the last really good Metallica album that they enjoy listening. Megadeth, you could also go for 4 or 5 after Rust in Peace. They changed from thrash metal to something else. Some would still list Countdown to Extinction as a great album. It certainly was a big success and they sold out a lot, before the gradual decline with Euthanasia and Cryptic Writings and ending up with Risk. So actually number 6 doesn't apply here very good at all. Then with Rush, yeah, you can say they really changed after Hemispheres, but Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures are absolute classic albums. They're still considered to be really, really good. Also, Iron Maiden's Seventh Son is very, very much loved album. Many say it's a really good album. So that doesn't really hold water. With Queen, I would go with number 7 because that's the number of albums they released in the 70s, Jazz being the final classic album before the gradual decline with The Game and then the hideous Hot Space. Merciful Fate, only 2 albums really. There was a long break after that. But if you want to go through all of that stuff, then I would argue for number 7. Voivod, probably I would cut it off around number 5. Nothing Face for me is the final really good album. Dio, maybe just the 2 first ones, Holy Diver and Last in Line. They're kind of like a unit. But, certainly I wouldn't go for 6. I think 6 would be Strange Highways. I think it's a pretty cool album, but I like Angry Machines even better, so I would definitely go for 7 there. Jethro Tull, kind of a difficult one. I think Passion Play was their 6th album. I don't think it's such a great album, personally. Thick as a Brick is, in my opinion, the best, so I would certainly go for number 5 there. Uriah Heep, probably 4. Demons and Wizards is usually the one that people really still love. Kate Bush, I would argue that the first 4 albums are the most classic ones. Not really a fan of the 5th and 6th album. I think it turns way too poppy around that time. But anyway, another way to look at it is to see whether the original 6 really is always that good. Well, many of the first albums of these bands aren't really that great. I'm not a huge fan of the first Black Sabbath album. I can historically see the importance it has, but the B-side on that one especially I think is kind of lousy, to be honest, with 2, not just 1, but 2 cover tracks. That's stupid. The first Judas Priest album isn't that great. The first Genesis album isn't that great. The first Dickinson, Tattooed Millionaire, I don't think is that great. Lots of cover tracks there and just like easygoing rock and roll music. And it's not shit, but it's not that great. I would argue that probably the newest Dickinson is better than the first one was. And if that doesn't break down the structure enough, how about a Rush releasing Caress of Steel as the number 3? I wouldn't call that a classic album. Or Van Halen's Diver Down, which is just ridiculously full of cover tracks once again. I mean, it's weird. The original 6 kind of holds up well if you cherry pick your examples. But at the end of the day, maybe it can help you if you're checking out some classic rock or metal bands. If they have a long career, check out their 6 first albums. And if there's nothing good there, it's kind of likely that they never released any interesting music at all. But I guess that's more due to the fact that record companies at that time wouldn't let you make tons of albums that just don't sell. If you don't make good music, you would be pretty soon kicked out. So that might explain why the younger bands would be hungrier. They would be more up to date with the style that really interests people. Like Black Sabbath, for instance, they were right on the money in the early 70s. But in the late 70s, the young and very hungry Van Halen just wiped the floor with these kind of old has-beens. Luckily, Black Sabbath did return and came back, but it's a fact that Black Sabbath was a very different band in the late 70s compared to what they were in the early 70s. So once again, there's a certain timeline within which you're going to release your music and you're going to change the world or not. It has to happen within those 5 or 6 years that you really like push through and make your big breakthrough, or you're likely never going to make it. So there you go. Is there a curse of the sixth? Well, I think my examples prove that there is no truth in such kind of silly ideas. Or are there?